Case 1. Stephany Elizabeth Bilecki, September 15, 2015 and November 20, 2017, Fairbanks Superior Court, Fairbanks, North Star Borough. In the state of Alaska, emergency dispatch centers operate around the clock, every single day of the year. The men and women who answer those lines are trained for the unpredictable, for accidents on frozen highways, for wilderness emergencies, for medical crises in communities where the nearest hospital might be an hour away by air. They are professionals who have learned to separate their emotional response from their operational one, to stay steady on the line while help is already moving toward whoever is on the other end. What the dispatchers in Fairbanks were not prepared for, what no level of professional training could have adequately equipped them to process, was the experience of receiving the same call from the same woman about the same kind of unthinkable situation 2 full years apart. That is the foundation of Case 1. And the details that investigators eventually uncovered would send a chill through the entire state of Alaska. Stephany Elizabeth Bilecki was a young mother living in Fairbanks, Alaska, a city that sits deep in the interior of the state, surrounded by boreal forest and defined by winters so severe that the cold itself becomes a daily negotiation. Life in Fairbanks has a particular rhythm and a particular kind of closeness. Communities knit themselves tightly around shared hardship, and mothers raising infants in that environment are generally understood to be doing one of the most demanding jobs imaginable. Bilecki had a daughter. Her name was Cheyenne, and she was 4 months old in the fall of 2015. 4 months old places an infant at a specific and extraordinary stage of early development. They are beginning to recognize familiar faces, beginning to respond to sound and voice and warmth, beginning to understand, in whatever wordless way infants understand things, that the world around them holds people who care for them. Cheyenne weighed only a few pounds. She depended on the adults in her life for every single thing. On September 15, 2015, the Fairbanks Emergency Dispatch Center received a call from Stephany Bilecki. Her infant daughter was not breathing. Responders arrived at the home and found Cheyenne in a critical condition. Every available intervention was applied. Cheyenne did not survive. She was 4 months old. The investigation that followed was careful and deliberate, as investigations into infant deaths in Alaska are required to be. Medical examiners and detectives worked through the available evidence, applying protocols designed to distinguish between the tragic but natural phenomenon of sudden infant loss and something that required a criminal response. The findings in 2015 were not sufficient to bring charges. The case remained open, documented, and on file. A tragedy without a courtroom resolution, at least for the moment. 2 years passed. Stephany Bilecki continued her life in Fairbanks. She had another daughter, a child named Jasmine. Jasmine was 13 months old by November of 2017, no longer a newborn, but still entirely a baby in every meaningful sense. She was at the age when toddlers are beginning to pull themselves upright, beginning to find their footing, beginning to discover the particular joy of movement and sound and the faces of the people who love them. On November 20th, 2017, the Fairbanks Emergency Dispatch Center received another call from Stephany Bilecki. Her daughter was not breathing. Responders arrived. Jasmine did not survive. She was 13 months old. For the investigators who had never fully closed the file on Cheyenne's passing 2 years earlier, the second call from the same mother transformed the nature of this case entirely. The legal and investigative standard for coincidence has limits. 2 infants, 2 years apart. Same mother, same home, same call to emergency services. Prosecutors and detectives launched what court documents would later describe as an extensive double homicide investigation, a probe that would be thorough, methodical, and ultimately devastating in what it revealed. The physical evidence was examined with fresh eyes, in light of both losses. Medical findings were reviewed. The timeline of events on both September 15, 2015, and November 20, 2017, was reconstructed in as much detail as the available record allowed. And then the investigators turned to the digital evidence. Digital forensics has become one of the most powerful tools available to criminal investigators in the modern era. Every action taken on a connected device, every search query typed into a browser, every website visited, every question sent into a search engine, creates a time-stamped record that does not disappear simply because the user closes the window or walks away from the screen. When investigators obtained and examined the digital devices associated with Stephany Bilecki, what they found was entered into the court record and presented during legal proceedings. According to those court documents, the searches Bilecki had conducted on her devices, searches made in the period directly before she placed those emergency calls, included inquiries into methods of suffocation and into how a person might bring about a loss of life without being detected. These were not searches made in the abstract, weeks or months removed from the events. The timing, as documented by forensic investigators and presented in Fairbanks Superior Court, placed those searches in close proximity to the moments when she then called emergency services to report that her children were not breathing. The defense raised arguments, as defense counsel is obligated to do in any criminal proceeding. Every defendant is entitled to representation, and the legal process in Alaska, as in every American jurisdiction, requires that the prosecution prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. The jury in Fairbanks Superior Court heard both sides of the argument. They returned convictions on 2 counts of second-degree unlawful taking of a life, one for Cheyenne and one for Jasmine. In December of 2024, a judge in Fairbanks Superior Court sentenced Stephany Elizabeth Bilecki to 130 years in the Alaska Department of Corrections, with 85 years of that sentence suspended. The net term she is ordered to serve is 45 years. Cheyenne was 4 months old. Jasmine was 13 months old. They never had the opportunity to grow into the people they might have become. Their names are now part of a court record in Fairbanks, Alaska, and because of the work of the investigators, detectives, prosecutors, and forensic specialists who refused to let those cases go unanswered, the person held accountable for their loss will answer for it for the rest of her natural life. In Alaska, as in every community across this country, the system's designed to protect the most vulnerable among us, the children who cannot speak for themselves, who cannot call for help, who depend entirely on the adults around them, must remain vigilant. If you or someone you know has concerns about the safety or welfare of a child, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock at 1-800-422-4453. They have counselors ready to help. Please use that resource. Justice, in this case, arrived later than it should have. But it arrived. And for Cheyenne and Jasmine, it is the only form of justice that remains available to them now. If this story moved you, if you believe these children's lives deserve to be told and remembered, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another episode of Cold Case Hour. Your support keeps this channel going and keeps these stories alive. Case 2. Nina Amigale Alexie, July 23, 2016, Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. There is a particular kind of grief that settles over a case when it ends not in a courtroom verdict, but in another tragedy, when the legal system, which exists to deliver accountability for the harm done to the most vulnerable, is denied that opportunity not by a legal argument or a procedural technicality, but by the loss of the defendant herself before the trial can even begin. Case 2 is that kind of case. It is a story about a 4-month-old girl named Amigale, about the mother who was charged with responsibility for what happened to her, and about the question of justice that was left permanently unanswered on January 6, 2017, a question that no future proceeding can now resolve. Nina Amigale Alexie was 22 years old in the summer of 2016. She was living at a transitional housing facility in Anchorage, Alaska, one of the social service facilities that exist across the state to provide temporary shelter and support to individuals and families navigating difficult circumstances. Transitional housing, by definition, serves people at some of the most vulnerable moments in their lives. It is a place where people are supposed to be working toward stability, toward a foothold, toward something better. Nina Alexie had a daughter. The baby girl was named Amigale, and like her mother, Amigale Alexie was in one of the most fragile periods of early human existence. 4 months old, entirely dependent, entirely without the ability to advocate for herself or signal distress beyond the limited vocabulary of infant communication. On July 23, 2016, someone at the transitional housing facility in Anchorage discovered something that required immediate emergency response. Amigale Alexie, 4 months old, was found cold and unresponsive, wrapped in a blanket. She was not breathing. Whatever had happened to her had already happened by the time she was found. The Anchorage Police Department and medical personnel responded. Amigale did not survive. What followed was an investigation into the circumstances of Amigale's passing. Investigators examined the physical evidence, the timeline of events at the transitional housing facility, and the circumstances surrounding how and when Amigale had last been in the care of her mother. The findings were sufficient, in the determination of Alaska prosecutors and a grand jury of Amigale's peers in Anchorage, to proceed with criminal charges. A grand jury, a body of ordinary citizens who review evidence in secret proceedings and determine whether sufficient cause exists to bring formal charges, returned an indictment against Nina Amigale Alexie. She was charged with second-degree unlawful taking of a life and manslaughter. These are serious charges that carry significant prison time under Alaska law, charges that would have placed her before a jury of her fellow citizens to answer for what happened to her 4-month-old daughter. Nina Alexie was taken into custody and transported to Highland Mountain Correctional Center, a facility outside of Anchorage that serves as a correctional institution for women in the Alaska Department of Corrections. She was there awaiting trial. The proceedings had not yet begun, the evidence had not yet been presented, the jury had not yet been seated, when on January 6, 2017, she lost her life by her own hand inside her cell. The manner of her passing was confirmed and documented. She was 22 years old. The legal proceedings against Nina Amigale Alexie ended the moment she passed away. Under Alaska law, as under the law of every American jurisdiction, criminal charges do not survive the death of the defendant. There was no trial. There was no verdict. There was no sentencing. The courtroom in Anchorage that would have heard the evidence about what happened to Amigale on July 23, 2016, never had the opportunity to render a judgment. What remains is the record, the grand jury indictment that documented what investigators found and what prosecutors believed the evidence showed. And what remains, above all else, is the memory of Amigale Alexie, 4 months old, wrapped in a blanket, found cold and unresponsive in a facility that was supposed to represent a path towards something better for her family. Cases like this one serve as reminders of why the protective systems surrounding vulnerable children, the reporting mechanisms, the welfare checks, the social service networks that exist in communities like Anchorage, must function with precision and urgency. Every 4-month-old child in the state of Alaska, in every kind of living situation, deserves protection. Amigale Alexie deserved that protection. The system was not able to reach her in time. The story of Amigale Alexie does not have a courtroom ending, but it has a name. It has a date. It has a record. And in the work of telling it accurately, with care for the dignity of everyone involved, there is at least the acknowledgement that her brief life mattered, and that what happened to her was serious enough for a grand jury of Alaskans to say, someone must answer for this. That answer never came. But the question, and the grief behind it, never goes away. Thank you for staying with this story. If it affected you, please like this video, drop a comment below to let us know your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more documentary coverage of cases that deserve to be remembered. Case 3. Ashley Ard. October 15, 2013. Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. Eagle River sits within the municipal boundaries of the city of Anchorage, Alaska, though it carries the feel of a separate community, a residential and semi-rural area tucked up against the Chugach Mountains to the east, connected to Anchorage proper by the Glen Highway, surrounded by the kind of natural landscape that gives even suburban Alaska a quality of remoteness that most American neighborhoods do not possess. There are trails here, and parks, and the particular quiet that comes from living close to forests and rivers and mountains that have no interest in the business of human beings. In the fall, Eagle River is beautiful in the way that Alaska fall is beautiful. The birch trees turning gold, the air sharpening with the approach of winter, the mountains behind the community catching the last warmth of a retreating season. The parks in Eagle River are the kind of places where families walk on weekend afternoons and children play and dogs run in circles, and the ordinary texture of community life asserts itself against the backdrop of the wilderness. On the night of October 15th, 2013, in one of those parks, in the cold dark of an October night in Alaska, where the temperature had fallen to a level that no unprotected human being, and certainly no unprotected newborn infant could survive for long without intervention. A baby girl was left alone under a tree. She had been alive when she was left there. She was not alive when she was found. The mother of that infant was Ashley Ard. She was 24 years old. The investigation into what happened in that Eagle River Park on the night of October 15, 2013, was not a mystery in the sense of an unknown perpetrator or an uncertain sequence of events. Ashley Ard had given birth. She had left her newborn daughter in the park. Those facts were established. What was not immediately clear, and what the legal proceedings in Anchorage Superior Court would spend considerable time examining, was the condition Ashley Ard had been in when those events occurred, and what that condition meant for the legal determination of her culpability. Postpartum psychosis is a term that most people have encountered at some level of awareness without necessarily understanding what it actually means in the life of the person experiencing it. It is important to be precise about this because the distinction matters, both for understanding this case and for understanding the broader landscape of maternal mental health in a way that might help prevent future tragedies. Postpartum depression is a widely recognized condition. It affects a significant percentage of women following childbirth, producing symptoms of persistent sadness, exhaustion, difficulty bonding with a new infant, feelings of inadequacy, and a generalized low mood that can range from mild to severely disabling. It is serious, it is real, and it requires professional attention. But a person experiencing postpartum depression, however severe, remains anchored to a recognizable version of reality. They know who they are. They know where they are. They know who their baby is. Postpartum psychosis is categorically different. It is a psychiatric emergency, a condition involving a break with reality that can produce hallucinations, delusions, profound confusion, and a disconnection from the world as it actually exists. A person in the grip of postpartum psychosis may believe things that have no basis in reality. They may experience the world around them through a filter so distorted that their own newborn infant is unrecognizable to them as what that infant actually is. They may take actions that appear inexplicable or monstrous from the outside, and that arise from a mental state so disrupted that the normal frameworks of intentionality and decision-making cannot be straightforwardly applied. The defense presented evidence that Ashley Ard had been experiencing severe and completely unaddressed postpartum psychosis at the time of the events of October 15, 2013. There was no record of any mental health treatment in the period surrounding the birth. No medical professional had identified the condition. No intervention had been offered or received. The crisis had developed and deepened entirely without any professional awareness or response. The defense also presented evidence of a second, compounding factor, domestic abuse. Ashley Ard had been living in an environment of intimate partner violence, a context that isolates a person from the very support systems that might have recognized and responded to a developing mental health crisis. Domestic abuse operates precisely by cutting off the connections that would otherwise provide safety and intervention. A woman who is controlled, monitored, and threatened by a partner is a woman who cannot freely seek help, who cannot openly tell a doctor or a friend or a caseworker what is happening in her home, who is living inside a closed system with no visible exits. Postpartum psychosis plus unaddressed and isolating domestic abuse plus a newborn infant delivered without adequate medical support equals a combination of vulnerabilities so severe that it demands a response from the legal system that is more nuanced than a simple assignment of the maximum available criminal charge. Anchorage prosecutors weighed the full picture. The original charge that the facts of October 15, 2013 might have supported, a charge reflecting the most serious assessment of culpability, was not the charge that ultimately resolved the case. In light of the documented psychiatric condition, the complete absence of mental health treatment, and the pattern of domestic abuse that had surrounded and exacerbated Ard's circumstances, a plea agreement was negotiated. Ashley Ard entered a guilty plea to manslaughter in Anchorage Superior Court. Manslaughter is a serious charge under Alaska law, one that carries genuine legal consequences and represents a formal acknowledgement by the court that what happened in Eagle River on October 15, 2013, was a criminal act. The plea reflects the court's recognition that culpability in this case could not be assessed without accounting for the full medical and personal context in which those events occurred. It is not an exoneration. It is not a dismissal. It is the legal system attempting to deliver accountability that is proportionate to the full and complex truth of what happened. Ashley Ard was sentenced in Anchorage Superior Court. The record reflects that accountability was delivered. But the questions that this case generates extend beyond the courtroom in ways that matter for the communities across Alaska and across this country that are home to women navigating pregnancy and new motherhood. Postpartum psychosis is a recognized medical condition. It is identified in psychiatric literature. There are treatment protocols. There are medications and therapies that are known to be effective when the condition is identified and addressed in a timely manner. The most critical word in that sentence is identified. Postpartum psychosis, like many mental health crises, is most dangerous when it goes unrecognized, when the woman experiencing it is too isolated to seek help, too confused by the symptoms to understand what is happening to her, or too enmeshed in an abusive relationship to have access to the kind of honest and open communication that might bring her condition to the attention of someone who could help. Ashley Ard appears to have been all three of those things simultaneously. No one identified what she was experiencing. No one intervened. The crisis reached its end point before any of the systems that might have helped her were even aware there was a crisis to respond to. The infant left under that tree in Eagle River, a newborn baby girl who had been in the world for only hours, who had not yet been given a publicly recorded name, who had not yet opened her eyes fully to the world that would have surrounded her, deserved to live. She deserved the warmth and care and attention that a newborn requires. She deserved the chance to grow into whatever person she might have become. That chance was taken from her on a cold October night in 2013. It was taken from her not by a calculating, fully aware adult who made a deliberate choice with complete knowledge of what she was doing, but by a woman in the grip of a severe and unaddressed psychiatric emergency that no one around her had recognized or responded to. The distinction matters. Not to diminish the loss of a newborn life, which cannot be diminished, but to understand it fully enough to prevent the next one. Postpartum mental health screening, accessible treatment, safe and supported pathways for women in abusive relationships to reach help without fear of further harm. These are not abstract policy considerations. They are the mechanisms that, functioning as intended, might have reached Ashley Ard before October 15, 2013. They did not reach her in time. The baby girl under the tree in Eagle River is the result of that failure. If you or someone you know is experiencing symptoms of postpartum depression or any other postpartum psychiatric condition, please reach out to a medical professional immediately. Postpartum psychiatric emergencies are treatable. They respond to intervention. Seeking help is not a sign of failure. It is the most important thing you can do for yourself and for your child. The National Maternal Mental Health Hotline can also be reached at 1-800-943-5746. Ashley Ard's sentence in Anchorage Superior Court delivered accountability. The legal system did what it could with the facts and the context that the evidence presented. The child at the center of this case is remembered here, briefly in the world, never given the chance to grow beyond the night of October 15, 2013, but remembered. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and drop a comment below. These stories matter. The lives at the center of them matter. And your support ensures that we can keep telling them. Case 4. Cedar, Sarten, October 14, 2023, Fairbanks Superior Court, Fairbanks, North Star Borough. When law enforcement officers respond to a welfare call, they carry with them not just the training and the equipment of their profession, but a particular kind of readiness. A mental preparation for the full spectrum of what a call might reveal. Experienced officers understand that a welfare check can resolve into the most ordinary of misunderstandings. A neighbor who was worried about an elderly resident who simply had their phone off. A family member who couldn't reach someone who had stepped out for the afternoon without telling anyone. They also know that a welfare call can open a door onto something that changes the course of an evening, a week, a career. Something that gets written into reports and case files, and, eventually, into court records that endure for as long as those institutions endure. On October 14, 2023, law enforcement in Fairbanks responded to a call. What they found when they arrived at the residence required the full mobilization of the investigative resources of the Fairbanks Police Department. Cedar Sarten was living in Fairbanks with her son, Robert. Robert was 5 years old. In the way that 5-year-olds everywhere are, Robert was at an age of remarkable and continuous discovery. A child at the stage when the world is enormous and fascinating and full of things to learn and touch and ask about. 5-year-olds have opinions. They have preferences for particular foods and particular games and particular stories. They have a sense of humor that is just beginning to understand timing. They have the specific and boundless energy of a child who has not yet learned to pace themselves against the demands of a day. Robert Sarten had all of that potential in front of him on October 13, 2023. He did not have it on October 15. When officers arrived at the Fairbanks residence in response to the call, they found Cedar Sarten with significant injuries that investigators documented as having been self-inflicted. They found conditions in the apartment that told a story, even before anyone had spoken a word. The bathtub, filled with water and evidence of violence. The physical tools of that violence recovered from the scene, a 20-pound kettlebell among them, along with knives. And in the bedroom, they found Robert. He was 5 years old. He did not survive. The physical evidence at the scene was documented by investigators with meticulous care because the documentation of that evidence would be the foundation upon which the entire legal case would eventually be built. In cases of this kind, where the scene itself contains the story, the work of the first officers and the forensic teams who followed them is the work that everything else depends on. What they photographed, what they measured, what they collected and labeled and preserved, all of it became part of the evidentiary record that would be presented in Fairbanks Superior Court. Cedar Sarten, when she was able to speak with investigators, offered an account of what had happened in that Fairbanks apartment. Her account placed the responsibility for what had happened to Robert and for her own injuries outside the household. She claimed an intruder had entered the residence, an unknown person from outside who had come in and caused the violence that investigators were now standing in the middle of documenting. This kind of claim, the unknown intruder, is one that investigators are trained to take seriously and to test rigorously. It is neither confirmed nor dismissed at the moment it is made. Instead, it generates a specific set of investigative questions. Where did the intruder enter? What evidence of entry exists? Broken locks, forced windows, disturbed points of access. What does the evidence at the scene suggest about the direction and nature of the violence? Are there witnesses? Is there external surveillance that would capture the approach or departure of an unconnected third party? Does the physical evidence, in its totality, support the presence of an intruder, or does it not? Investigators at the Fairbanks apartment worked through every one of those questions. They examined the entry points of the residence. They analyzed the distribution of the physical evidence, where objects were found, what their condition suggested about how they had been used and by whom, what the patterns of the evidence indicated about the sequence of events. They worked the forensic evidence against Cedar Sarten's account, testing it for consistency. What prosecutors would later present to the Fairbanks jury was a comprehensive and systematic demonstration that the physical evidence in that apartment did not support the claim of an outside intruder. The story Sarten had told about what happened on October 14, 2023, was, in the prosecution's presentation, contradicted by the evidence in detail after detail. Cedar Sarten was charged with first-degree and second-degree unlawful taking of a life in connection with what happened to Robert on October 14, 2023. The trial that followed in Fairbanks Superior Court was extensive. It required the presentation of forensic evidence, testimony from investigators and experts, and the careful reconstruction of events in a way that allowed 12 jurors to evaluate the full record. The trial lasted through a period that included the winter and spring of 2026, a long, deliberate, and serious proceeding in a case that demanded exactly that seriousness. On May 15, 2026, the jury in Fairbanks Superior Court returned its verdict. Guilty on both counts, first-degree and second-degree unlawful taking of a life. At the time of this documentary's production, Cedar Sarten is awaiting sentencing. That sentencing is scheduled for September 30, 2026, in Fairbanks Superior Court. The full legal consequences of the jury's verdict will be determined at that proceeding. Robert Sarten was 5 years old. He spent October 14, 2023, in a home that should have been the most protected place in his world, the place where a child can be a child, where the biggest challenges of the day are the ordinary challenges of being 5 years old, where the adults present are present specifically to ensure that nothing bad happens. He did not survive that night. The Fairbanks Police Department, the forensic teams, the prosecutors of the Fairbanks District Attorney's Office, and ultimately the 12 members of the Fairbanks jury who sat through the full presentation of evidence and returned their verdict on May 15, 2026. All of them did their part in ensuring that Robert Sarten's story was taken seriously, documented fully, and answered in the only way that the legal system can answer. The sentencing in September of 2026 will close this chapter of the legal proceedings. The chapter of Robert's life was closed on October 14, 2023. He was 5 years old. He deserved to be 50. He deserved to be a person with a full and complex life ahead of him. Choices made and unmade. Relationships built. Experiences accumulated. Mornings in Fairbanks and summers that felt like they would never end. None of that happened. None of that will happen. But the jury in Fairbanks said, "We saw the evidence. We evaluated it. We delivered our verdict." And the system that exists to protect children, however imperfect and however limited it is in what it can ultimately provide, did not look away. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment below. Robert's story deserves to be remembered. Your support ensures that it is. Case 5. Jessica Beagley, October 2010, Anchorage District Court, 3rd Judicial District. In the landscape of criminal cases involving harm to children, the evidence that brings a case to the attention of investigators and prosecutors usually arrives through channels that are, at least on the surface, somewhat indirect. A neighbor who notices something, a teacher who reports a concern, a medical professional who sees something in a clinical examination that prompts a call to Child Protective Services. The evidence is gathered, assembled, and built into a case over time. And then there is the case of Jessica Beagley, a case in which the evidence was not gathered by investigators at all, but was created, labeled, packaged, and submitted to a nationally broadcast television program by the person who would ultimately be charged based on its contents. Jessica Beagley was a mother living in Anchorage, Alaska, in 2010. She had multiple children, including a 7-year-old boy who had been adopted. The specific details of how Jessica Beagley responded to what she perceived as misbehavior from this child were not secret. They were not hidden behind closed doors in a way that required months of investigative work to uncover. They were documented on video that Beagley herself had recorded, that she had kept, and that she chose to submit to the production team of a nationally broadcast daytime television program as part of an appeal for parenting guidance. The program was the Dr. Phil Show, a widely watched daytime broadcast featuring discussions of personal and family conflicts, behavioral issues, and psychological challenges, often with guests seeking advice or intervention. Beagley submitted her footage to the show in that spirit, as documentation of a parenting challenge she was seeking help with. The footage that she submitted, and that was subsequently broadcast during October of 2010 to an audience that numbered in the millions, showed her forcing her 7-year-old adopted son to ingest hot sauce. Not as a condiment, not in a meal. As punishment, she required him to swallow it. She required him to hold it in his mouth. The documentation showed his reaction, the physical distress of a 7-year-old child being forced to consume a substance specifically designed to produce a burning, painful sensation. And then, as an additional disciplinary measure captured on the same footage, Beagley required the boy to stand in a shower in which the water was set to a temperature cold enough to constitute a significant physical shock. When the footage aired on national television, the response was immediate and national. Viewers who watched the broadcast did not see what Beagley apparently saw when she reviewed her own footage, a parent seeking guidance. They saw a child being subjected to a form of treatment that crossed a line that most people recognize instinctively, even without consulting a legal definition. The Anchorage Police Department received the complaint that followed the national broadcast. Investigators reviewed the footage, the same footage that millions of Americans had watched on television, and assessed what it documented against the standards of Alaska law. They spoke with relevant parties. They documented their findings. And they brought a criminal charge against Jessica Beagley for what the video showed her doing to her 7-year-old adopted son. The charge was misdemeanor child abuse under Alaska law. The classification reflects the specific nature of the conduct documented, serious enough to constitute criminal abuse, but fitting into the statutory framework of the misdemeanor tier rather than a felony charge. The legal proceedings in Anchorage District Court were not complicated by evidentiary uncertainty. The evidence was the video. The video had been submitted voluntarily by the defendant. It had aired on national television. The factual record of what had occurred was not meaningfully in dispute. Jessica Beagley was convicted of misdemeanor child abuse. She was sentenced in late 2011 to 3 years of probation. The public response to the Beagley case was significant and extended well beyond Alaska. The Dr. Phil broadcast, the national media coverage that followed, and the criminal proceedings in Anchorage together generated a sustained conversation about the legal and ethical boundaries of disciplinary practice toward children, and about the specific and complex dynamics of adoptive parenting, which involves its own set of challenges and demands that differ in important ways from biological parenting. 7-year-old children who have come through the adoption process have often experienced disruption and uncertainty before they arrive in their adoptive homes. The attachment process between an adoptive parent and a child is a real and documented psychological phenomenon that takes time, patience, and specific knowledge to navigate successfully. The resources available to adoptive parents, support groups, therapy, guidance from adoption specialists, exist precisely because the process is complex and because the children involved have often arrived in their new families carrying the weight of whatever circumstances made adoption necessary in the first place. Beagley's appeal to the Dr. Phil show was, in a narrow sense, an appeal for help with parenting. But the method she had been using, which she was willing to document and share, was one that investigators and the Anchorage court determined crossed into criminal territory. The child at the center of her footage was not an abstraction. He was a 7-year-old boy who had already experienced the disruption of the adoption process and who found himself in a home where his perceived misbehavior was met with a response that a national audience watched with concern and that a criminal court confirmed was abuse. He did not choose to be filmed. He did not choose to be broadcast to millions of viewers. He did not choose to be the central subject of the news cycle that followed his mother's criminal conviction. He was 7 years old. He was trying to navigate his world with the tools available to a 7-year-old. The Anchorage court system delivered a conviction. The probationary sentence that followed was what the misdemeanor classification allowed. The outcome on the legal record, a criminal conviction for child abuse, entered in Anchorage District Court in 2011, stands as the formal acknowledgement that what happened to that boy constituted a criminal act under the laws of Alaska. The broader lesson embedded in this case is one about visibility and accountability. When conduct toward children is brought into public view, whether through a television broadcast, a social media post, a neighbor's report, or a teacher's observation, the systems of accountability that exist to protect children can activate. The Beagley case activated those systems through one of the most unusual mechanisms imaginable, the defendant's own submission of her own footage to a national media program. But the mechanism, however unusual, worked. The systems were activated. The court delivered its verdict. The work of protecting children depends on visibility, on the willingness of communities to look, to report, and to trust that the systems in place will respond. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline, available at 1-800-422-4453, is one of the most important tools available for that work. If you see something that concerns you about a child's treatment, that number is available every hour of every day. The 7-year-old boy at the center of Case 5 was protected, imperfectly, belatedly, through an unusual chain of events, by the combination of a national television broadcast and an Anchorage police department that took what it saw seriously. He deserved better than the path that led to his protection. But the protection arrived, and the record of why it was necessary is preserved in the files of Anchorage District Court. Please give this video a like, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement keeps this channel alive and ensures these stories continue to reach the people who need to hear them. Case 6. Heather Renee Alexie, February 6, 2025, Fairbanks Superior Court, Fairbanks North Star Borough. A wellness check. 2 words that carry the specific bureaucratic weight of a routine procedure. Something scheduled in a calendar, ticked off a list, recorded in a case management system as completed. Case managers across Alaska and across the country perform thousands of wellness checks every week. They knock on doors. They speak with residents. They assess the visible indicators of whether things in a household are progressing as they should be. The vast majority of wellness checks resolve into the ordinary. The resident is fine, the situation is stable, the check can be marked completed, and the next one scheduled. On February 6, 2025, a case manager performed a wellness check at an apartment in Fairbanks, Alaska. The door opened, or was found, and what the case manager discovered inside that apartment was something that no amount of professional preparation could make unremarkable. 6-year-old Peter Alexie was inside that apartment. He had not survived. Peter was 6 years old. 6 is the age of first grade, the age when a child steps out of the protected and relatively narrow world of early childhood into the larger and more complex environment of school, with its classrooms and teachers and other children, and the beginning of a formal relationship with learning that will, in one form or another, occupy the next 12 years of their lives. 6-year-olds are developing in ways that are visible and rapid. Reading beginning to come together from individual sounds into actual words, arithmetic beginning to make intuitive sense, friendships beginning to carry real emotional weight. Peter Alexie had a 5-year-old sister. He had an apartment in Fairbanks. He had a mother named Renee Alexie. He had 6 years of a life, and then he did not have any more. The case manager who discovered Peter's condition immediately engaged the emergency response system. Law enforcement was notified. Investigators from the Fairbanks Police Department mobilized and arrived at the apartment. What they found there, the condition of the apartment, the evidence of what had occurred, the physical documentation that investigators compiled, was recorded with the thoroughness that a case of this magnitude requires. Renee Alexie was not in the apartment when the case manager arrived. She had left, had taken her 5-year-old daughter and departed Fairbanks, traveling south toward Anchorage. The awareness that she was no longer at the scene, that she was mobile and moving away from Fairbanks with a child in her care, made the already urgent situation more pressing still. Law enforcement needed to locate her quickly, both to bring her into custody and to ensure the safety of the 5-year-old who was with her. Investigators engaged the tools available to them for locating a person in motion across the vast geography of Alaska. Among those tools, and among the most effective in the modern investigative environment, is the interception and analysis of cell phone data. The location information generated by a mobile phone, the signals it emits as it connects to cell towers across a geographic area, creates a trackable trail that investigators with the appropriate legal authority can access and use to determine where a phone, and the person carrying it, has been and is currently located. Alexie's cell phone data was intercepted. Her location was established. Anchorage law enforcement, coordinating with Fairbanks investigators, moved to intercept her. She was located and taken into custody in Anchorage. When investigators spoke with Renee Alexie following her arrest, she provided a confession. She acknowledged that she had caused the harm that had resulted in Peter's passing. And she offered, in that confession, an account of her mental state at the time of those events. An account that, if accurate, placed the events of February 6, 2025, within a framework that is as medically serious as it is legally complex. Alexie told investigators that she had been experiencing severe visual hallucinations in the period leading up to Peter's passing. The hallucinations, she said, were of a specific and terrifying kind. She perceived her son Peter as a threat to her. She believed, not as a thought she could examine and correct, but as a visceral and overwhelming perception that displaced her ability to see her son as he actually was, that Peter was attempting to harm her. The cause of these hallucinations, according to her account, was an abrupt and significant change in her psychiatric medication regimen. The specific mechanism she described, a sudden shift in medication without appropriate monitoring or transitional support, is documented in psychiatric literature as a risk factor for severe adverse mental health episodes. When a person who is dependent on psychiatric medication for the management of a serious mental health condition undergoes a rapid change in that medication without adequate clinical support, the results can include the emergence of psychotic symptoms, including hallucinations and delusions, in an acute and dangerous form. If Alexie's account is accurate, and the investigation into its accuracy was ongoing at the time of the legal proceedings documented here, It presents a picture of a child whose life was lost not because his mother chose to harm him with full and deliberate awareness, but because a mental health system failed to provide the monitoring and support that a medication transition required. That explanation does not provide a legal justification for what happened to Peter. The Alaska criminal justice system does not adjudicate based on explanations alone. It adjudicates based on evidence, charges, and the legal standards applicable to the specific circumstances. Heather Renee Alexie was charged with second-degree unlawful taking of a life in connection with Peter's passing on February 6, 2025. At the time of this documentary's production, that case is pending in Fairbanks Superior Court. The full legal proceedings, the trial, the presentation of evidence, the determination by a jury of Heather Alexie's culpability have not yet concluded. The charge stands. The investigation is documented. And Peter Alexie's passing is part of the public record. Peter's 5-year-old sister, the child who was with her mother in Anchorage when Heather Alexie was taken into custody, was immediately placed in the care of appropriate protective services. Her welfare in the hours, days, and weeks following her mother's arrest was the immediate and serious concern of the system that now had responsibility for her. She is 5 years old. She was present for events that no 5-year-old should be present for. Whatever the outcome of the legal proceedings against her mother, this child's path forward requires the full and sustained support of Alaska's child welfare system. The case of Peter Alexie sits at the intersection of two urgent and under-resourced areas of public concern: child welfare and mental health care. The monitoring of patients who are undergoing significant psychiatric medication changes is not a luxury. It is a clinical necessity, particularly for patients whose conditions, when unmanaged, carry a risk of harm to themselves or others. When that monitoring is absent or inadequate, the consequences can be catastrophic. And the people who bear the consequences most directly are the most vulnerable people in the household. The children who have no ability to evaluate what is happening to the adult who cares for them, who cannot seek help, who cannot leave. Peter Alexie was 6 years old. He was at the beginning of the part of his life that opens outward, toward school, toward the world, toward the enormous and as yet unmapped territory of a future that should have contained decades of experience and growth and becoming. He did not reach that future. He was 6 years old on February 6, 2025, and then he was gone. The legal proceedings in Fairbanks Superior Court will deliver whatever accountability the law makes available. For Peter, it is the only form of formal acknowledgement that remains. Thank you for staying with this story. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment below. Peter's story deserves to be heard. Your support ensures that it is. Case 7. Denali, Dakota. Skye, Brehmer, June 2, 2019. Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. There are cases in the files of the American criminal justice system that resist, even after years of documentation and legal processing, the ordinary frameworks through which we understand crime. Cases in which the facts, laid out in sequence, still feel impossible, not because the evidence is uncertain, but because the chain of decisions and events that produce the outcome seems to require a kind of credulity that reasonable people do not naturally extend to the stories they read about the world. Case 7 is one of those cases. It is a case about online manipulation and real-world consequence, about the intersection of a digital fantasy and a summer afternoon in Alaska, and about a 19-year-old woman named Cynthia Hoffman who went to a place called the Eklutna Tail Race with people she trusted and did not come home. Denali, Dakota. Skye Brehmer was 18 years old in June of 2019. She was living in Anchorage and had developed an online relationship, a sustained digital connection, conducted over a messaging platform, with a person who presented themselves as someone of extraordinary means. This person, in the communications they exchanged with Brehmer, represented themselves as a billionaire. Someone with wealth so extensive that the amounts they were prepared to offer were, in the context of an 18-year-old's daily reality, effectively incomprehensible. The person Brehmer was communicating with was not a billionaire. He was not wealthy. He was not in Alaska. He was, as investigators would later establish through the legal process, a man named Darren Schillmiller, located in the state of Indiana, who had constructed an entirely fabricated digital identity and was using it to reach across the country and manipulate a teenager into doing something that Miller could not do himself and would not have done himself, because Miller was the author of a plan that required someone else to execute it. What Miller offered Brehmer, as documented in the court records of the legal proceedings that followed, was $9 million. $9 million is a number that has a specific effect on a person who has never held $100 in their hands for longer than it took to spend it. It is a number that bypasses ordinary risk assessment and reaches into a part of the decision-making process that operates outside the careful and calibrated evaluation of consequences. It is an amount so large, so far outside the frame of ordinary experience, that it can become, in certain circumstances, something close to an abstraction, a thing that feels more like a concept than a real possibility, and that is precisely the quality that makes it effective as a manipulation tool. In exchange for $9 million, in exchange for a payment that did not exist from a source that was not what it claimed to be, Miller told Brehmer he wanted her to film a person losing their life. He wanted documentation. He wanted proof. He wanted to watch it. Brehmer, according to the evidence presented in Anchorage Superior Court, agreed to this arrangement. She recruited people she knew in Anchorage to assist her, and she identified the person who would be at the center of the plan. That person was Cynthia Hoffman. Cynthia was 19 years old, 1 year older than Brehmer, at the beginning of the adult life that 19 represents. She was Brehmer's close friend. The record describes a genuine friendship between them, not an acquaintanceship, not a casual connection, but the kind of relationship that carries trust and history and the expectation that the people you spend your time with are people who wish you well. Cynthia Hoffman did not know what the plan was. She had no reason to suspect that anything about June 2, 2019, was different from any other summer day in Anchorage, that the outing she was joining, the people she was going with, had a purpose that had been determined without her knowledge and would end in a way that she would have no ability to respond to. On June 2, 2019, Brehmer and a group of individuals she had recruited drove to the Eklutna race, a location outside Anchorage in the Matanuska-Susitna region, accessible by road, situated in the kind of Alaskan landscape that is beautiful and remote in equal measure. The Eklutna race is where water is channeled from the Eklutna hydroelectric system, a river-like corridor of cold, moving water set in terrain that, depending on the season, can feel either peaceful or isolating. On a June afternoon, with the long Alaska summer light, it is the kind of place that could plausibly be described to someone as a destination for a walk or an afternoon outing. Cynthia Hoffman arrived at the Eklutna race with people she considered her friends. What happened there was recorded, because recording it was the point of the entire operation, the proof that Miller demanded as the condition of the payment he had promised. Denali Brehmer shot Cynthia Hoffman in the back of the head. Cynthia Hoffman, 19 years old, did not survive. The recording was transmitted to Darren Miller as evidence that the arrangement had been fulfilled. The $9 million was never sent. The $9 million never existed. Darren Miller was a man in Indiana with a messaging platform and a fabricated identity and the willingness to use them to manipulate a teenager in Alaska into ending the life of her closest friend. He watched it happen on a screen, through a video transmitted from a remote location near Anchorage, and he had never been within thousands of miles of any of it. Cynthia Hoffman's remains were discovered. The investigation moved quickly. Investigators traced the digital communications that formed the spine of the entire plan, the messages between Miller and Brehmer, the recruitment of the other participants, the planning and coordination that preceded June 2, 2019. They built a case that laid out the full chain of manipulation, decision, and consequence. Both Brehmer and Miller were identified as perpetrators. Both faced criminal accountability. Denali Dakota Skye Brehmer was charged with first-degree unlawful taking of a life. She was convicted. In February of 2024, she was sentenced in Anchorage Superior Court to 99 years in the Alaska Department of Corrections. She will spend virtually every remaining year of her life behind bars in Alaska. Darren Miller, whose digital manipulation set the entire tragedy in motion, was prosecuted in Indiana and faced his own legal reckoning for the role he played in Cynthia Hoffman's passing. Cynthia Hoffman was 19 years old. She went to the Eklutna race on June 2, 2019, with people she trusted. She trusted them because she had no reason not to. The friendship she believed she was in was real on her side. The trust she carried with her to that location was genuine. None of what she understood about the day she was having bore any relationship to the reality that had been constructed around her without her knowledge. She was 19 years old. She had her entire adult life in front of her, the relationships she would form, the choices she would make, the person she would become through the accumulation of experience and time. None of that happened. All of it was taken from her at the Eclut Natal race on a June afternoon by a plan that had been designed by a man in Indiana and executed by an 18-year-old in Anchorage who had been convinced that $9 million that did not exist was worth the price of her closest friend's life. The sentence of 99 years delivered in Anchorage Superior Court in February of 2024 reflects the magnitude of what Denali Brehmer did. It reflects the determination of the Alaska court system to hold her fully accountable for the most irreversible act imaginable. It does not restore Cynthia Hoffman to the life she deserved. Nothing does. But it is the answer that the legal system is capable of providing, and it was provided in full. Cynthia Hoffman deserves to be remembered as a 19-year-old who was loved, who was someone's friend, who walked into a summer afternoon in Alaska with trust in the people around her, and deserved to walk out of it the same way. She did not. But her name is here, in this record, and the story of what happened to her, and why, and who was responsible, is documented in the files of Anchorage Superior Court for as long as those files exist. If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Cynthia's story deserves to be heard. Your support ensures that it continues to be. Case 8. Anya James. Continuous abuse from 2000 to October 2010. Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. The cases that persist the longest without detection are not always the ones that are the most carefully hidden. Sometimes they persist because the hiding takes place inside the ordinary structures of a family home. Inside the walls of an address that has a mailbox, a front door, a neighbor on either side, and a community around it that has no way of knowing what the walls are concealing. The neighborhood looks the same as every other neighborhood. The house looks the same as every other house. And inside, behind a door that opens and closes like every other door, something has been happening for years that bears no resemblance to anything the outside world would recognize as a home. The case of Anya James unfolded across a full decade. It involved 6 children. It produced a level of documented harm that investigators, when they finally gained access to the evidence, described in terms that have stayed in the public record of Anchorage's legal history. And it ended, not with a quick and efficient legal resolution, but with a process that required years after the arrest to reach the sentencing that finally closed it. Anya James was a resident of Anchorage. She had moved through the formal processes of Alaska's adoption system and had adopted 6 children. The adoption system is built on a specific and serious premise, that children who cannot remain with their biological families deserve to be placed in permanent homes where they will be safe, loved, and provided for. The process of becoming an adoptive parent involves screening, evaluation, home studies, and ongoing oversight. It is not frictionless. It is not casual. It is a deliberate process designed to ensure that the children placed through it are going to households prepared and committed to caring for them appropriately. Anya James passed through that process. She was approved. 6 children were placed in her home. And then, from the year 2000 to the year 2010, she subjected them to a sustained campaign of confinement, deprivation, and harm that court records describe in specific and disturbing detail. The bedroom doors in the James household were fitted with alarm systems. Not the kind of alarms designed to alert residents to intruders from outside, but alarms designed to alert Anya James if any of the 6 children in her home attempted to leave their rooms without permission. The windows were similarly rigged. The children were confined, not as a temporary disciplinary measure, not as a brief and isolated response to a specific incident, but as an ongoing, normalized, sustained condition of their daily existence. They could not move through their own home freely. They were monitored and controlled in their movements in a way that had nothing to do with parenting and everything to do with control. The children were subjected to severe food restriction over the course of years. The term used in court records reflects the documented medical consequences: starvation. Children who were growing, whose bodies were at the ages and developmental stages that demand consistent and adequate nutrition in order to support normal physical development, were not being provided with what their bodies required. The results were not abstract or statistical. They were physical and permanent. Medical professionals who examined the children following their rescue documented growth impairment significant enough to be irreversible, bodies that had been altered permanently by years of insufficient nourishment during the developmental stages when nutrition is not optional but essential. The children were denied access to basic sanitation. In a home where their movements were controlled and their access to the ordinary facilities of the house was restricted, they were required to use a container, a kitty litter bucket, as a bathroom. Not a bathroom, a bucket. In a household with functioning plumbing. In a city with every modern amenity, 6 adopted children were being required to use a container as their sole sanitation facility. During the entire decade that these conditions persisted, from 2000 to 2010, Anya James was collecting adoption subsidy payments from the state of Alaska. The adoption subsidy system exists to support adoptive families in providing care for children who might otherwise require more intensive and expensive state services. It is funded by public money, collected and dispersed through the Alaska Child Welfare System, and it is provided to adoptive families on the premise that they are using it to support the children in their care. Anya James collected $750,000 over the course of that decade. $750,000, public money, dispersed in support of 6 children who were being confined, deprived of food, denied sanitation, and subjected to conditions that no child welfare system in the world would characterize as appropriate care. She collected the money while the children suffered. The investigation that eventually uncovered what was happening in the James household was launched in 2011. What triggered it? The specific report or observation or piece of information that opened the door is part of the investigative record. What followed was 8 months of intensive work, documented in court filings as a sweeping investigation that built the case presented in Anchorage Superior Court. Anya James was arrested in May of 2011. The charges against her reflected the full scope of what investigators had found. Multiple counts of first-degree child endangerment and assault, 1 set of charges for each of the 6 children who had been in her care. The charges acknowledged that each child was an individual who had been individually harmed, not an abstraction, not a statistic, but a person with a name and a story and a body that bore the consequences of a decade in Anya James's home. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest were not quick. They were not simple. Cases of this scope and complexity, involving multiple victims, a decade of documented conduct, extensive forensic and medical evidence, require time to build and present and adjudicate. The timeline from arrest in May of 2011 to sentencing stretched across years. In October of 2017, 6 years after the arrest, 17 years after the abuse began, Anya James was sentenced in Anchorage Superior Court. 6 children entered the Alaska adoption system looking for what every child looks for: a home, a family, the basic safety and care that childhood requires. They were placed with Anya James. For a decade, what they received instead was confinement, starvation, deprivation, and control, while the woman responsible for their care collected $750,000 of public money designated for their support. The Alaska adoption system exists because children need families, and because there are families, good, committed, capable families, willing to provide what those children need. The system has placed thousands of children in homes that have given them exactly what they were supposed to receive. The case of Anya James is not a reflection of the system's intent. It is a reflection of the gap that can exist between what an approval process can assess and what actually happens behind closed doors over the course of a decade. The 6 children who were in Anya James's home are now adults. They carry with them the physical consequences of those years, the growth impairment that medical professionals documented as permanent, the psychological weight of a childhood that bore no resemblance to what childhood is supposed to be. They are also people who survived, who were reached, eventually, by a system that found them and removed them and documented what had been done to them and built the case that ended with a sentencing in Anchorage Superior Court in October of 2017. The system was late. The system took 10 years to find them. That is part of the record too, the part that demands ongoing attention to the monitoring and oversight of adopted children, to the follow-up visits and the accountability mechanisms that exist to ensure the gap between approval and reality does not grow into a decade of unchecked harm. If you have concerns about a child in your community, any child, in any kind of living situation, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Your call may be the thing that reaches a child before another decade passes. Thank you for staying with Case 8. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and share this documentary with someone who should hear it. Your support ensures this channel can continue telling these stories. Case 9. Stephany, Hamburg. Continuous neglect culminating in May 2017. Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. Among the different forms that harm to a child can take, and this documentary has examined several of those forms across its 10 cases. Some of the most difficult to recognize in real time are the ones that move slowly. The ones that do not announce themselves in a single event or a single moment of crisis, but accumulate gradually, across weeks and months, as a child's condition deteriorates in a direction that no one outside the household is positioned to observe. These are the cases that are hardest to intervene in before they reach their end point. Because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. A door is closed. A family is inside. The ordinary surface of a residential neighborhood or an apartment building gives no indication of what is happening within any particular unit. And inside, a child who has no ability to seek help on her own is experiencing something that, over time, is doing her irreparable harm. Gabriella Marlowe was 2 years old. She had been given a name that is full of warmth. Gabriella, a name with weight and music to it. She was at the age that 2-year-olds inhabit in the particular and wonderful way that only 2-year-olds can. The age of beginning sentences and insistent assertions of self, of running toward things with the confidence of a person who has not yet learned caution, of the specific kind of attachment to the people in her life that makes a 2-year-old reach up for a hand without needing to think about it. 2 is an age of becoming, of momentum, of growth so continuous that it is almost visible on a weekly basis to anyone paying attention. Gabriella was not growing. She was declining. The evidence presented in Anchorage Superior Court established that Stephany Hamburg and her partner had restricted Gabriella's diet to a single food source, whole milk. Whole milk, and nothing else. Not as a temporary measure during an illness, not as a transitional food during a period of supply difficulty, but as the sustained and ongoing sole provision of nutrition for a growing 2-year-old child. Pediatric medicine is clear on the nutritional requirements of toddlers. Children between the ages of 1 and 3 years are in a period of rapid physical and neurological development that makes adequate and varied nutrition not a preference, but a biological necessity. The vitamins, minerals, proteins, and caloric density that support that development cannot be delivered by whole milk alone, however appropriate whole milk might be as one component of a balanced toddler diet. A child receiving only whole milk is not receiving iron in the quantities her developing blood and brain require. She is not receiving the range of vitamins that support neurological development, bone density, immune function, and the dozens of other biological processes that a 2-year-old body is running simultaneously. She is not receiving enough calories to fuel the energy demands of a child at this stage of development. The consequences of this restriction, as Gabriella experienced them, were progressive and visible to anyone with access to observe them. She lost weight. She became weak. The developmental momentum that a healthy 2-year-old carries with them, the energy and physical confidence and constant motion, was replaced by a decline that moved in the opposite direction from everything that a 2-year-old's body is supposed to be doing. This decline culminated in May of 2017. Gabriella Marlowe, 2 years old, lost her life as a result of congestive heart failure. The cardiac failure, as documented by medical professionals and presented in Anchorage Superior Court, was directly caused by the severe malnutrition she had experienced as the result of a diet restricted entirely to whole milk. Her heart, a muscle like every other muscle in her body, dependent on the nutrition and oxygenation that adequate overall health provides, failed because the body that housed it had been systematically deprived of what it needed to sustain her. Congestive heart failure in a 2-year-old is not a sudden event. It is the endpoint of a biological deterioration that takes time, weeks and months of a body doing what bodies do when they are not being fed adequately, which is to begin cannibalizing their own resources in an attempt to maintain the most critical functions. A child's body, small and growing and demanding, can sustain this process for only so long before the demand outstrips the available reserve. Gabriella's body reached that point in May of 2017. She was 2 years old. The investigation into Gabriella's passing was launched following her death and the determination of the cause of that death. Medical findings established the causal relationship between her diet and her cardiac failure. Investigators documented the circumstances of her care, the food she had been provided, the duration of the restriction, the absence of any medical consultation or intervention during the period of her decline. The findings were presented to Anchorage prosecutors, who assessed the evidence and brought charges against Stephany Hamburg. The charge was criminally negligent homicide, a charge that does not require proof of an intent to harm, but does require proof that the defendant's conduct represented a gross deviation from the standard of care that a reasonable person would apply, and that this deviation caused the victim's death. The evidence of Gabriella's diet, her documented decline, and the causal relationship between that decline and her cardiac failure provided the factual foundation for that charge. Following Gabriella's passing, Stephany Hamburg did not immediately remain available to law enforcement. She evaded contact. The investigation continued in her absence, and law enforcement worked to locate her. In November of 2017, 6 months after Gabriella lost her life, Hamburg was located and taken into custody at a trailer park. The investigation that had continued during her absence was complete. The case against her was fully documented and ready to be presented. The legal proceedings in Anchorage Superior Court were extensive and took years to reach their conclusion. The case involved medical testimony, nutritional science, a reconstruction of the timeline of Gabriella's decline, and the detailed documentation of the decisions made in Hamburg's household over the period during which Gabriella's diet was restricted. The court process gave both the prosecution and the defense the full opportunity to present their respective positions to the jury. On December 5, 2025, more than 8 years after Gabriella Marlowe lost her life, Stephany Hamburg was convicted of criminally negligent homicide in Anchorage Superior Court. At the time of this documentary's production, she is awaiting sentencing, which is expected in the middle of 2026. 8 years. 8 years between the May afternoon in 2017, when Gabriella's heart stopped, and the December day in 2025, when a jury delivered its verdict. 8 years during which Gabriella's name existed in the legal system as an open case, as a file not yet resolved, as a child whose story had not yet received its formal courtroom answer. That answer arrived on December 5, 2025. The sentencing will follow. And for Gabriella, 2 years old, a girl with a name full of warmth and music, a girl who deserved the full provision of nutrition and care and developmental support that every 2-year-old is entitled to. The legal system's response, however long it required, stands as the formal acknowledgement that her life was real, her suffering was real, and what was done to her was a crime under the laws of Alaska. Parents, caregivers, neighbors, and members of communities everywhere have a role to play in the protection of young children. If you are concerned about a child's nutrition, development, weight, or overall health, if something seems wrong in a household that you have contact with, please speak to a pediatric health provider or contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Early intervention saves lives. The call you make might be the one that reaches a child in time. Gabriella Marlowe deserved more than 2 years. She deserved the full reach of a childhood and an adolescence and an adulthood and all of the ordinary and extraordinary things that a life contains. She deserved to be fed and held and supported through the enormous developmental work that 2-year-olds are doing every single day. She received none of that. What she received instead cost her her life. The verdict of December 5, 2025 says, in the formal language of the court, the community of Anchorage, through its legal institutions, saw what happened to Gabriella Marlowe and refused to let it stand unanswered. Please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Hour, and leave a comment below. Gabriella's story deserves to be heard and remembered. Your engagement keeps this channel alive and keeps these stories reaching the people who need to hear them. Case 10. Mechele Linehan, September 24, 1996. Anchorage Superior Court, 3rd Judicial District. The final case in this documentary occupies a category of its own, not because the events at its center are less serious than those that have preceded it in this episode, but because the legal journey of this case traces an arc that the other 9 cases do not. A journey from investigation to indictment, to trial to conviction, to appellate reversal, ending not in a sentence that endures, but in an overturned verdict and a permanently unresolved legal question. It is the case of Mechele Linehan, and it begins in Anchorage in the mid-1990s, in the era before widespread internet access, before the digital forensics tools that feature in Case 1, before the cell phone tracking capabilities that helped investigators locate Heather Alexie, in an Anchorage that was, in many ways, a different city than the one that exists today. Alaska in the 1990s was experiencing the economic rhythms that have defined the state across its modern history. The boom and contraction cycles of an economy built on oil, on fishing, on the particular opportunities that a large and resource-rich state offers to people willing to work in conditions that most Americans would find demanding. Anchorage, as the state's largest city and its commercial hub, attracted workers from across the country and around the world. Men and women drawn by the prospect of wages that the lower 48 could not always match, willing to live with the isolation and the cold and the distance from family in exchange for the economic opportunity that Alaska represented. Among the establishments that served this transient and often cash-heavy population was the club where Mechele Linehan worked as an exotic dancer. She was young, she was in Anchorage, and she was building the kind of social network that the environment of that industry creates. A network of relationships with the men who frequented the establishment, relationships of varying depth and complexity and authenticity, existing within an economic and social context that shaped everything about them. One of the men in that network was Kent Leppink. Kent was connected to a family with financial resources. He had become involved with Linehan in a way that, in the account that prosecutors would eventually construct and present to an Anchorage jury, gave her access to information about his financial situation, specifically, the existence of a life insurance policy. The policy was substantial, $1 million, and it listed Mechele Linehan as a beneficiary. On September 24, 1996, Kent Leppink was found on a trail near Hope, Alaska. Hope is a small community on the Kenai Peninsula, a place that is accessible from Anchorage by road, driving south on the Seward Highway and then west on the Hope Highway, a route through terrain that is dramatic and beautiful and, on the right stretch of road, entirely without witnesses. Kent Leppink had been shot. The manner of the shooting, according to the investigators and prosecutors who would eventually describe it in court, was consistent with a deliberate and targeted act, an execution-style shooting, in the language that the case record eventually employed. He was gone. The investigation into Kent Leppink's passing opened in 1996 and did not reach its courtroom conclusion for more than a decade. This was not unusual for a case of its complexity. Building a case centered on the theory that one person orchestrated the criminal act that another person carried out, establishing not just who pulled the trigger, but who planned and directed the entire sequence of events, requires assembling a level of evidence that goes beyond what a more straightforward investigation demands. It requires establishing motive, means, communication, and the chain of decision and action that connects the person who planned to the person who acted. The theory that Anchorage prosecutors developed, the theory they eventually presented to a jury in 2007, was this: Mechele Linehan had orchestrated Kent Leppink's passing. She had, in the prosecution's account, used her relationships with the men in her social network to manipulate a man named John Carlin III, another person who was romantically connected to Linehan, into carrying out the shooting of Kent Leppink. The motive, in this theory, was the $1 million life insurance policy. The method was the manipulation of a person who cared about Linehan into doing something that served her financial interest. By the time the case reached trial in 2007, Mechele Linehan had been gone from Alaska for years. She had built an entirely different life on the west coast of the continental United States. She was married. She had children. She had a professional career in the healthcare field. The Mechele Linehan who sat in the defendant's seat in Anchorage Superior Court in 2007 was, by every outward measure, an entirely different person from the young woman who had worked in an Anchorage club in the mid-1990s. The trial took place. The prosecution presented its theory of the case, the evidence supporting it, and the testimony of witnesses who could speak to the relationships involved, the communications that had occurred, and the chain of events that preceded September 24, 1996. The defense argued against the prosecution's theory, challenged the evidence, and presented its own account of the facts. The Anchorage jury convicted Mechele Linehan of first-degree unlawful taking of a life. She was sentenced. It appeared, in 2007, that the Lepink case had finally reached its conclusion, 11 years late, but concluded. Then the Alaska Court of Appeals reviewed the case. The appellate court system in Alaska, as in every American jurisdiction, exists for a specific and essential purpose. It is the mechanism through which the legal system ensures that convictions obtained at the trial level were obtained through a process that complied with the constitutional and procedural requirements that govern criminal proceedings in the United States. An appellate court does not retry the case. It does not reevaluate the evidence in the way that a trial jury evaluates it. What it does is examine the trial record for legal errors, errors in the admission or exclusion of evidence, errors in the instructions given to the jury, errors in the procedural conduct of the trial that are significant enough to have affected the outcome. In 2010, 3 years after the conviction, the Alaska Court of Appeals issued its ruling on Mechele Linehan's appeal. The court found that the trial had been significantly compromised by the admission of evidence that was highly prejudicial to the defendant and that should, under the applicable rules of evidence, have been excluded from the jury's consideration. The specific evidence at issue, evidence that the court determined crossed the line from relevant and probative to prejudicial in a manner that violated Linehan's right to a fair trial, was significant enough, in the court's analysis, to have materially influenced the jury's verdict. The conviction was completely overturned. Not reduced. Not modified. Overturned entirely. Following the appellate court's ruling, the legal proceedings against Mechele Linehan in connection with Kent Lepink's passing did not continue to a retrial. The case, in its legal form, was resolved by the appellate court's decision, not in the way that Kent Lepink's family had spent 11 years waiting for, but resolved nonetheless. What this means in legal terms is precise and specific. Mechele Linehan is not a convicted person in the state of Alaska in connection with Kent Lepink's passing. The conviction that was returned in 2007 does not stand. It was vacated. She has not been found guilty by a legal process that the appellate system determined was sound. What it means in every other sense is far more complicated, and that complication is permanent. Kent Lepink was a real person. He was found on a trail near Hope, Alaska, on September 24, 1996, and he was gone. He had family. A family who attended the trial in 2007, who heard the guilty verdict, who believed for 3 years that they had the answer they had been waiting 11 years to receive. And then the appellate court overturned that verdict. And the answer they had been given was taken back. The Kent Lepink family's experience of this case spans 30 years of calendar time, from September of 1996 to the present. It spans a decade of investigation, a trial, a conviction, an appellate reversal, and the permanent absence of a verdict that holds. It spans everything that the legal system can offer and, ultimately, the limit of what the legal system was able to deliver. The Alaska Court of Appeals did not conclude that Mechele Linehan was innocent. It concluded that the trial was not conducted in a manner that comported with the constitutional and evidentiary requirements of a fair proceeding. Innocence and an overturned conviction are different things, legally different, factually different, and meaningful in different ways depending on where you stand in the landscape of this case. From where Kent Lepink's family stands, the distinction may provide little comfort. The question of what happened on that trail near Hope, Alaska, on September 24, 1996, who made the decision, who directed it, who is ultimately responsible for a man being found shot on an autumn day on a trail in the Kenai Peninsula, is a question that no future legal proceeding can now answer. The legal process has run its course. The files are closed. The question endures. There is a specific and difficult kind of accountability that the legal system is sometimes unable to deliver. Cases are built on evidence, and evidence has limits. Trials are conducted through processes, and processes have rules. Appellate courts enforce those rules, because the rules exist for a reason, because the rights they protect are rights that apply to every defendant, including defendants who may be guilty, Because a system that removes those protections for some defendants is a system that removes them for all. The Linehan case is, in that sense, a story about the legal system functioning as designed, producing a result that is formally correct in the eyes of the appellate court, while leaving behind a human reality that the formal correctness cannot address. Kent Lepping's family was left with a case that the legal system could not resolve. The Kenai Peninsula where it happened is still there. The date of September 24, 1996, is permanent, and the question of what actually occurred on that trail, in the full truth of it, remains unanswered. This documentary closes with Case 10 because Case 10, in some ways, captures something true about the justice system that the other 9 cases do not. The reality that accountability and truth are not always the same thing, and that the system designed to pursue one does not always succeed in revealing the other. 9 of the 10 cases in this episode reached formal legal conclusions, convictions, sentences, verdicts that stand in the record of Alaska's courts. Case 10 reached a legal conclusion of a different kind, a reversal, an overturned conviction, and an open question that time has now foreclosed. For the communities of Anchorage and Fairbanks and Eagle River, and hope that appear across this documentary, for the people who live in those places and whose lives have been shaped in various ways by the events documented here, the ongoing work of the legal system, the child welfare system, the mental health support network, and the broader social infrastructure that exists to protect the most vulnerable matters as much as any individual case. These are not isolated events. They are part of the larger story of how communities protect their children, support their most vulnerable members, and respond when those protections fail. Cold Case Hour exists to document that story, case by case, name by name, date by date, court record by court record, to tell the stories of the people at the center of these events with accuracy and with respect, to examine the systems that succeeded and the systems that failed, and to do all of that in a way that serves the communities that need these stories to be told. If you have concerns about the safety or welfare of a child, any child, in any situation, please contact the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. The line is open every hour of every day. Your call might be the most important one a child ever has someone make on their behalf. To every person who watched this full episode of Cold Case Hour from the first case to the last, thank you. Thank you for your attention, your time, and your willingness to sit with stories that are difficult and painful and real. These stories matter. The people at the center of them, Cheyenne and Jasmine, Amigale, the unnamed newborn girl in Eagle River, Robert, the unnamed 7-year-old boy, Peter, Cynthia Hoffman, 6 children in an Anchorage home, Gabriella Marlowe, and Kent Lepping. All of them matter. Their names deserve to be spoken. Their stories deserve to be told. And the record of what happened to them deserves to be preserved in a way that is accurate, respectful, and worthy of the lives they lived. Please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment below telling us which case in this episode affected you most deeply, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour if you have not already done so. Every subscription, every like, every comment is an act of support for the work of telling these stories with the seriousness and care they deserve. This channel is built on that work. Your support is what keeps it going. We will see you in the next episode of Cold Case Hour.